This is
Yep.
Ruby broadcast.
Okay. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our live conversation with Dr. Sue Dyson. I am Megan Phillips of the Train with Trust Project, here with Jody Ambrose, also of the Train with Trust Project. The Train with Trust Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to disseminating information about animal behavior and how we can also embrace evidence-based training practices. And we are joined once again by Dr. Sue Dyson, world-renowned equine orthopedist and researcher. And we are going to be delving into some hot topics in the horse world today. We have this conversation and many others that we have brought forward to everybody with the goal of bringing everybody onto the same page, finding consensus, and improving the welfare of equines. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jody to head up the conversation that we're having today about how we can empower change in the equine industry. I'll be in the background. If you have any questions, please feel free to post those in the comments, and we'll try to answer those if we can, whether we do that live or if we need to follow up with you, but we'll try to address your comments and questions. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Jody.
Okay, so my background, for those who don't know, is that I am a behavior consultant and educator with Train with Trust Project and our for-profit arm Train with Trust. So I've been doing that for about almost 20 years, using a lot of positive reinforcement, helping people sort of figure out why their horses do what they do and change their behavior. But my original job is as a dressage rider and trainer, and I've competed through Grand Prix. I train horses through Grand Prix. And what a lot of people don't know is that Dr. Dyson is also a high-level competitor in eventing. And so we have, in addition to an interest in equine behavior, we both have a strong interest in the horse industry, the competitive horse sport industry. And of course, lately there's been a lot going on. And so this conversation grew out of our own conversations that we were having about what's been going on in the horse industry. I think everybody probably knows what's going on, but I will just summarize real quick that several very, very high profile trainers and competitors have been either suspended, exposed for abuse, called out, eliminated, warned in competition. There have been videos that have circulated. There have been, in some cases, potential criminal charges. And of course, it's just created a maelstrom of debate and controversy and disagreement among everyone who's involved in horses, from the highest levels down to the casual observer. I think almost everybody has a strong opinion about what's going on, and it's been very polarizing. And so we always strive to help people understand the issues that are going on with horses, and this is just one more thing that we thought we might be able to bring some perspective to. Dr. Dyson has so much knowledge on the topics of horses that are uncomfortable, stressed, in pain. And really, when we talk about welfare, we're trying to look at how do we avoid causing those issues, and how as trainers and riders, and how do we fix those issues when we see them. And in order to do that, we need to be able to identify them and understand what's causing them. So the goal for this discussion is to create a deeper understanding of all of those things, and offer some ideas for how you can find common ground, have conversations that are productive, take actions that are productive. And I really truly believe that the vast majority of us have shared values that we're interested in promoting, and so how do we change things for the better as a whole? So Dr. Dyson, as you and I talked about this, one thing came up repeatedly, which is that, when faced with a horse that is displaying behavior that is undesirable or having trouble in a competition or anything that that we would like to improve on. Sorry, I lost my we need to explore the reasons behind this. And I think the best way to do that is to ask why it's happening. In consulting, we call it functional analysis. What is analyzing the thing that is being achieved by the animal by displaying the behavior or not, or refusing to display the behavior. Can you talk a little bit about asking that question and how to approach that question in a way that can help us understand?
Well, shall we take the first example? And this, and I don't really want to call out names, but this is a picture of Sir Mark Todd giving a schooling session, which was video recorded and subsequently released. And the rider in question had come for this coaching session saying that she wanted advice about how to get her little horse to jump into water because she had been having problems. And the way that was chosen by Sir Mark was to encourage the horse with coercion. So he didn't have a whip available, so he picked up part of a tree, a small branch, and hit the horse with the branch. And I have no idea how many times he hit the horse with the branch, but eventually the little horse did jump down into the water. But earlier on in the video, we had seen this little horse trot down the bank on the far side into the water very confidently. So that to me told me that the little horse was not fearful of the water. I know there are some horses that are fearful of water, and you just have to take your time to encourage them to go into the water, sometimes by giving a lead with another horse, sometimes just by allowing them just to take one step into the water and then giving them positive reinforcement by giving them some food and telling them they've done well. That wasn't the approach taken here because the little horse would trot willingly into the water. So it wasn't afraid of the water, but for some reason, it did not want to jump down into the water. And then we have to ask, well, why might a horse be quite happy to trot into water down a small slope, but why wouldn't it want to jump down into water? Which would not, I would think, reflect fear. Now, when this little horse trotted in circles on the grass, you could see that it was lame in front, or I could see that it was lame in front. And my suspicion is that this little horse didn't want to jump down into the water because the impact on landing would accentuate its pain, and it was avoiding that pain by not jumping into the water. So we've used here coercion to make the horse jump into water. The question is, and I throw this back to you, is does coercion result in a positive experience, a positive learning experience for the horse?
Absolutely not. And I think an example that a lot of people can relate to is in trailer loading. I think we all have experience, most of us have experience loading a horse in a trailer through coercion by, basically making, people like to use the phrase making the hard choice, making the wrong choice hard and the right choice easy. And that is coercion. That's a definition of coercion, is basically making the behavior that you want the only option. And I was just loading a horse in a trailer yesterday, and he has historically been forced in. And instead of, trying to push him in and get him in as fast as possible, we've taken our time and given him several opportunities to explore. And we've played games with him where, he can go in and out and in and out. And now he runs into the trailer, and you can see that what tells you that it's not a positive experience is that when you go to do it again, it's not any better. They're not any more eager to do it. So, there are opportunities where fear might develop. This horse may have been okay with the water from a certain angle, seen something different at this angle, and had a fear reaction. Either way, whether it's pain or fear, that coercion is basically making that horse shut down and ignore what's going on physically for it.
I think we all probably need to hold up our hands and say we have all hit horses to make them do something.
Absolutely.
I certainly have.
Yep.
And I do think that very occasionally, with the appropriate timing, which has to be very, very quick after the horse has not done something, you can possibly, in some selected circumstances, create a positive experience for the horse. And yes. I recall a little horse that was stopping repeatedly with the rider, and I was asked to ride it. I approached the fence as I normally would, and the horse started to slow down and tried to stop. And I did hit that horse sharply on the neck, and it jumped the fence, and I went with the horse and gave it a good experience over the jump. I then came to the jump again and again and again, and it jumped beautifully. And the next day we went out and won 2 classes on this horse.
Mm-hmm.
So this horse had a positive experience over the jump and learnt that the jump was not something to be feared.
Right.
And gained confidence progressively thereafter. But that was split second timing. And because I didn't believe that the horse had any underlying pain-related problem, it needed to have confidence that it could jump and it wasn't going to have a bad experience, because the own rider was riding defensively. And on the few occasions when the horse would jump with her, she would tend to get left behind. And therefore, effectively, she would pull the horse in the mouth over the fence. So the horse was being punished for jumping. So it had lost its confidence because it was a bad experience for it.
Yeah, that's a great example, because it's not that coercion can't be effective and doesn't work. Obviously, it works, and that's why people use it. It has to do with what happens afterwards.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it has to, in this situation that we've been talking about, with this little horse not wanting to jump into the water, I asked the question, was the coach thinking about why the horse did not want to jump into water? Or did he recognize that the horse was lame or not? Or was he just trying to fulfill the wishes of the client? The client's wish was to make this horse jump into water. And this has conventionally been a way that people have used to encourage the horse to jump into water.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in today's world, we have to improve this, whilst always holding up our hands and saying, we've probably all done wrong under some circumstances. We need to admit that we've done wrong, and we've got to think about improving the ways in which we tackle these issues. And I've heard some coaches take the view, well, I'm just banning mobile phones now
Yes.
to avoid being pilloried on social media by such things like this. And I would have to say, Sir Mark, I think, is a beautiful, beautiful rider. Mm-hmm. And he showed extreme contrition after this. And I'm sure that he has learnt from this experience without a shadow of a doubt. But I do think it is a good example of the failure to properly probably think through, why did this horse not want to jump, and not recognizing that the horse was in fact lame. And I suspect that nobody recognized that it was lame. And that's a very common scenario.
Yeah. And, it makes, I know you said, you don't want to call anybody out, but we are talking about a specific human being here. And I'm thinking about the videos of Charlotte Dujardin with the whip. And, we have a video in that case. So it's, we have a little bit more information. And I also think that video shows a situation that's a little bit different too, because in this case, it's very clear what it is, like what they're asking the horse to do, and that there's an end point to that behavior. So not defending his behavior here at all, there was a better way to accomplish this, starting with asking why. But if you look at training, you could also mention the videos of Cesar Para training piaffe dressage, lots of videos of trainers training piaffe dressage with a whip. Are you trying to accomplish a behavior that has a specific goal that has an end point? Is there something the horse can do to make the whip stop? Yeah. And I think in this case, it's a little more clear what the horse could do to make the whip stop.
Absolutely.
If it's an ongoing thing, I think it's a fair also to say, if a horse is not getting its hind end underneath itself, is there a physical problem or even a conformation issue, why the horse is not coming under? If the horse is not stepping high enough in the piaffe dressage, both of those questions apply. But is there a moment where it's enough? Or is this coercion, this pressure that you're applying with a whip, does it have an end point? Is there some place where it will be enough?
So let's move to the next slide, which I think is depicting.
Oh, sure we go.
And this, to me, was a very, very different scenario, as you have just pointed out. And I'm not absolutely clear what movement they were aiming to achieve, except they were obviously trying to make the horse go forwards with more energy. But they didn't achieve that in any way, because as the horse was being hit repeatedly, the rider had restraining hand cues. So the poor horse was completely confused because it's having conflicting cues. Mm-hmm. And doesn't know how to respond, and retaliates by bucking and kicking out, retaliates by stopping, and yet gets no relief whatsoever because the beating continues. And the horse was clearly in a state of fear and confusion, and there was no end point as far as I can see. There was no relief for the horse. So I really don't know what they were trying to achieve here, because you were creating such a stressful environment, far more stressful than the previous example, under which no horse can learn. It's just going to develop fear. And the most common reasons for a dressage horse being reluctant to go forwards properly in response to the rider's cues, or not show sufficient energy, is because it's uncomfortable behind. Mm-hmm. And very frequently, there is not overt lameness in the conventional sense. These horses are often bilaterally affected, that is, both hind limbs are affected. It may be absolutely symmetrical. So the only thing you see is not as much energy as you would like. Now, sometimes that will be accompanied by other behavioral signs consistent with those behaviors that we have in the Ridden Horse Pain Ethogram, which will be a trigger to me to say, yes, there is underlying discomfort. We never got the opportunity to see this horse work without coercion, so I can't comment at all about what if there was an underlying problem or not.
Yeah, which raises a good point, which is when we see these isolated moments, it doesn't, often you see people defending it by saying it's a moment in time. It just because we don't know all of the context doesn't mean that we can't have an opinion about what's going on, but we do need more context to really understand the full picture.
Absolutely. And I would say that I would always be very hesitant to make any negative comment based on single frame photographs.
Absolutely.
Because I think we do need to see video footage of the horses moving in order to understand better what is going on. But with this horse, we never saw it moving without coercion, and the pattern of movement was so irregular, it's impossible to make any comment about whether or not there was any underlying discomfort as the primary reason for this horse's being subjected to this coercion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in less extreme situations, sometimes people do jump to an assumption. I would never buy a horse off a still picture. And for the same reasons, I don't pass judgment on a rider or the way that they're training based on a single picture of that's posted online or a single moment from a competition. And in some ways, that also is, a dilemma of judges in subjective sports like dressage, where they can see the horse moving, but they're limited in what ways they can see the horse moving. And so they have to judge what's in front of them and can't determine. I know I recently saw a controversy about a horse that was eliminated from a competition for lameness, which is extremely rare, because when you have limited information as a judge, it's very difficult to determine the cause of whether something is being caused by an ongoing problem. You don't see the warm up, you don't see the horse afterwards, and there's various factors that can confound your judgment if you don't have the full picture.
Yes. Shall we move on to the next slide, which I think is a fairly similar scenario, but taking place in Denmark. So this is again a horse being whipped by a rider under the watchful eyes of the trainer. The trainer is somebody who's also themselves been subject to investigation for his training methods at his yard, and he is currently suspended by the Danish Equestrian Federation, as is the lady who is seen here repeatedly whipping this horse.
Yep.
And again, I don't think we know what the circumstances were. The video footage is available. I just captured these still pictures from the video. But again, it was repeated whipping of the horse in a rather aggressive manner, which was again not, in my view, going to achieve anything positive except create fear and tension in the horse. Now that might, on a short-term basis, improve its movement patterns, but I don't think that it's a good learning experience in any way, shape or form. And I think that it's really important that everybody is aware that in order for horses to learn, they have to be in the right emotional state. If they are overly stressed through either pain or coercion, they're not going to be undergoing a proper learning experience. And likewise, if a horse repeatedly fails to perform a movement correctly, just repeatedly performing that movement over and over again badly is also not going to achieve anything from a positive learning perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really important concept that a lot of people don't understand, which is, I think people are starting to understand the concept of trigger stacking, which, is that when there's more than one thing going on, they're cumulative, not separate, whether it's fear or pain or both, they add to each other, not overlap. But what that does is push an animal towards a threshold that once they cross, they can't take in information. They're not learning. They don't process things in the same way. And your only opportunity to change behavior is when you can bring an animal further away from that threshold by lowering their level of stress, lowering their level of pain, changing your approach to be more, your communication to be more clear. You can de-escalate all of those triggers to keep them in a place where if something does add to it, it's not going to push them over that threshold where they can't take in new information and learn.
Yes, and as soon as they've done something right, give them some reward, be it a stroke on the neck or walk on a long rein, something positive so that they recognize that they have done right. And to develop a consistent method of rewarding horses, I think, is a very important part of training.
Yeah, it's a very important part of communication.
Yeah.
Because people think of our communication with horses too often as one direction of us communicating to them. And so they don't think of it as two-way, where the horse is giving us something back and then we have to respond. So those rewards are responding to them and making that communication go both ways, which is how effective communication works.
Yeah. Should we move to the next slide? I guess we included this because we wanted to discuss a little bit about hyperflexion or roll cur. And this is not unique to the dressage world. And I think that the dressage world is being under super scrutiny for this practice, but you will see it with similar frequency, if not more, in the warm-up of show jumping horses.
Absolutely.
And I guess it raises a number of different questions, in that any abnormal posture sustained for excessive lengths of time is going to result in muscle fatigue. But when we think about flexion like this, I don't think I've actually got any evidence that from a musculoskeletal perspective, we are necessarily doing long-term harm. You're certainly going to restrict the passage of air from the horse's nasal passages down the trachea, because the trachea is going to get squashed. And therefore, you're going to limit the delivery of air to the horse's lungs. But obviously, we don't want to see this sort of position. And to an extent, we face a situation when the stewards are not monitoring the situation adequately, if this is happening. And the rules of dressage in the warm-up are very clear. The rules for show jumping are very muddy. And I feel that there needs to be consistency in approach, rather than saying this is not going to be judged in the show jumping arena, but it is going to be judged in the dressage arena.
Yeah, I think roll cur is one of the few welfare issues that has really gained traction with the masses in terms of people looking for it and calling it out. And I think that's a good thing. I think awareness is always the first step to changing and improving rules and practices. However, I think that head and neck position is not the only thing that's going on. And I think head and neck, I think it's caught on with the general public because it's easy to see. When you say behind the vertical, a vertical line is a very easy thing to identify. And so any horse that's behind the vertical immediately calls people's attention to it and makes people and gets more scrutiny. And I do think that there has been some misunderstanding of the nuances of head and neck position. I think that, the FEI discovered that when they tried to address this because they said this kind of position is okay, this kind of position is not okay, and people didn't really understand the difference. And I think just like in the same way that the 24 behaviors are not, you don't evaluate a horse based on one behavior on the ethogram. You need to look at the context of the whole horse and what's going on. Is there tension in the back? Is there, is the mouth open? Are the eyes soft? What are the ears doing? What does the stride look like? All of those things are important in evaluating roll cur. And I think it goes to show how complicated, I think, for judges and stewards, it can be really fraught to identify what is roll cur if you don't have an understanding of the context, the full picture of what's going on with the horse. And it takes a really trained eye, I think, to identify what horses are really in distress and which horses are not.
Yes. I was part of the expert panel that met in Switzerland when the current rules for dressage warm-up were reviewed. And at that time, I was there to talk about the physical impact of roll cur versus low, deep, and round, which is much less extreme than this, versus the so-called correct head and neck position. And there was a strong opposition to any form of neck position other than with the head in a vertical position or slightly in front of the vertical position from Dr. Gerd Huschmann from Germany. But when we actually debated this issue, there was a lot of common ground in that it was accepted among all the experts that low, deep, and round was not necessarily detrimental to the horse, and in some aspects had positive movements if performed correctly and if performed without coercion and if not sustained for an unduly long period of time. So at the time, I thought there were some very sensible conclusions that came out of the meeting. But what has happened subsequently is that I'm not sure that the stewards have been adequately trained in what to look for, and nor have they necessarily been adequately empowered to take action till recently. And that's been one of the problems. And as I say, I don't think it is in any way enforced or even looked for in the show jumping warm-up, whereas it is in the dressage warm-up. And that seems to be an unfair playing field. Why be super critical about dressage riders and not criticize the show jumpers?
And I think it highlights why we're having conversations like this, because we feel strongly that the key is education. I think, the stewards need to be educated and empowered, but the public also needs to be educated when you call out situations that are not roll cur as roll cur, it doesn't help the cause of identifying it and changing it in the sports. And so I think that's, you talking about how that discussion went is a good example of how when you find common ground, you can find consensus and make decisions. Whereas I don't think that carried over in terms of educating the public about the difference between the two. I see a lot of confusion about the two, and a lot of misinformation about who started it. I remember seeing horses in this frame when I started out in the early 80s. And yet there are individuals that are blamed for, inventing this way of riding. And it's certainly, always been an issue. And I think the governing bodies could probably do a better job of communication, again, not just between us and our horses, but communication between them and the public, and really helping people understand what it is that is harmful about it, exactly what we're doing here, trying to parse what it is that is bad about it, and how to identify that, so that when you're speaking out about it, you're helping other people understand.
Yes, and I think it's very important to look at different riders, which I've spent a lot of time doing, and there's some very skillful riders who can work their horses in low, deep and round for a short period, and then bring them up so that they are in what we would accept is a correct frame for competition. So they use that long, deep and round as a way of stretching the top line muscles of the horse. They use it as part of their warm-up, but the horses can change in their frame, change in their balance, and can subsequently work properly and well when they're ridden by very skilled riders. The problem that arises is when the less skilled rider tries to copy this and perhaps uses a degree of force to create a low, deep and round outline, or is unable to work the horse in the correct way, and the horse becomes stuck with its head behind the vertical and never moves correctly and never develops the right movement patterns or the appropriate muscle strength and coordination to work properly. And there we have a problem.
Yes, and it's made exponentially worse when people can't see, when the trainers can't see the difference. I think biomechanics are very complex, and it takes a trained eye to see the difference. And so the people that may not be able to do it correctly need people on the ground that can see when they're doing it correctly. And there needs to be more education on what it looks like, because if people want to be able to do it correctly, they need someone to teach them how to do it correctly. And I think there is a lack of understanding of what it should look like. Again, we've done a talk about what a happy horse looks like, and I think there's a lack of focus on correctness. What does a horse look like when they're going well? And not everybody can see that. It's much easier for people to pick apart what someone's doing wrong. And riding these horses is really hard, and it's never going to be perfect. If it was, everybody would get 100% scores, and there'd never be any placing, because everybody would do well. But we need to also focus on what people are doing correctly in order to teach people what it looks like.
Yeah. So shall we move on to the next slide? So in my observations of application of the Ridden Horse Pain Ethogram at various levels of competition, I've noticed that there is a different frequency of occurrence of mouth opening with separation of the teeth for 10 seconds or more at different types of competition. So at low level eventing, it was observed in 35% of horses. And in low level eventing, all the horses are wearing snaffle bridles and a variety of different noseband types. At 5-star 3-day events, in which the riders can either use a snaffle bridle or a double bridle, mouth opening with separation of the teeth for 10 seconds or more was seen in 44% of the horses. the majority of the horses are competed in snaffle bridles. It's a minority that use double bridles. At World Cup Grand Prix dressage, the frequency of occurrence was 68%. And at Grand Prix dressage, currently, double bridles are compulsory. We also looked at sub-elite Grand Prix dressage competition at the national championships in the UK, and the frequency of occurrence of mouth opening was 81%. So then I asked myself, well, why are there these differences? And to me, this could either be because it's a difference between the double bridle and the snaffle bridle, or it is the way the double bridle is being used, and the potential movement of the rider's hands, or it could be because at Grand Prix dressage, the movements are biomechanically much more demanding on the horses, and they are struggling with those movements, so they open their mouths. And I don't think that at the moment we have an answer for this. But it's disturbing because this is one of the features that, particularly at the Olympic Games in Paris, we repeatedly in the Grand Prix dressage saw horses with their mouths open, and the commentators, when it was broadcast on television, were making comments about this. And if you looked on social media, there was lots of comments about mouth opening as well. And this is not a good picture to be presenting to the general public, I don't think, because it's something which is very obvious. Interestingly, I attended the British Dressage Championships last Friday and watched the entire medium championship. So these were horses that had to do shoulder in, travers, half pass in trot and canter, walk pirouettes. That was the kind of level of movement. And at that level of competition, it is optional whether or not you use a snaffle bridle or a double bridle. I applied
to be the equivalent of like third level-ish.
Yeah, I think so. So I applied the Ridden Horse Pain Ethogram to all the horses, and the most common score out of 24 was only 3. The middle 50% scored between 1 and 3, and the overall range was between 0 and 7. There was only one competitor with a 7. Of the 34 competitors, 14 used a double bridle, and 64.3% of those horses had mouth opening with separation of the teeth for 10 seconds or more. 20 used a snaffle bridle, and only 30% of those horses had their mouths open. So that's a big, big difference. More than twice as many of the horses with a double bridle had their mouths open. Now I have to ask, I guess, why were those competitors choosing to use a double bridle? But nonetheless, there was clearly a difference between the two groups, the snaffle bridle versus the double bridle. Now, there's this huge debate within member countries of the FEI about whether or not double bridles should become optional in Grand Prix competitions. And there's several national federations, several of the Scandinavian countries, that at the last round of rule changes applied for a rule change to make double bridles optional. And the FEI has refused to change the rules, saying that there was no scientific evidence behind any rule change. There was some work presented last weekend at the British Equine Veterinary Association Congress when they looked at rein tension being applied by the same riders riding the same horses in double bridles versus snaffle bridles. And but they were only evaluating these horses moving in straight lines, in slow paces, with no advanced movements.
Mm.
And they showed it's a relatively small study that the rein tension was higher in those horses being ridden in snaffle bridles than it was in those horses being ridden in double bridles. But the study's got limitations because it's a small number of horses. They're only going in straight lines. They're not being asked to do any difficult movements. They're certainly not being asked to do piaffe or passage or counter pirouettes. So I'm not sure that that is scientific evidence that is useful to make a decision about whether or not double bridles should be optional at Grand Prix level.
Well, go ahead.
Should we go on to the next slide?
I was just going to say that you have talked a lot in the past about the limitations of study design and the information that we can gather on, aversive equipment ethically. And so when the FEI draws that line of there's no scientific evidence, do you feel that it's even realistic that we can have conclusive science to
I think it is very difficult because I think it's you can't carry out a blind study. You couldn't get a dressage rider to ride a Grand Prix test in a snaffle bridle and then in a double bridle and then in a snaffle bridle, for example, and necessarily expect that that's going to give you the answer, because the rider may be biased themselves and may ride the horse differently because they want to perhaps preserve the use of the double bridle, because some of these horses are potentially very exuberant horses. And I think that some of the riders feel that if double bridles become optional, that's the slippery slope downhill, and that ultimately double bridles may be banned. And I don't think dressage riders want that.
No.
What I think, could we go to the next slide, please? I think that this is Glamourdale at the Olympics. And not actually at the Olympics, but this is Glamourdale, and this is how he looked at the Olympics, with his mouth open a lot of the time. And he was successful. Won individual bronze. He often has his mouth open a lot of the time. I think if we were to make double bridles optional, then we could do a prospective study and look at hundreds of horses, those in double bridles and those in snaffle bridles, and then say, well, have we reduced the amount of mouth opening? That would be the only way I can see it answering the question, is the mouth opening related to the double bridle? Now, we may see the riders having to use more coercive hand cues if the horses are in snaffles, and we may not see any difference in mouth opening. But until we can do that, I don't think we can have an answer. And it's interesting to me that going back to Charlotte Dujardin, she often with Vallegro said that she worked the horse at home in a snaffle. She only put the double bridle on because she had to for competition. And there are some countries in which, in national competition, double bridles are now optional. I think we have to change somehow. And I think it's very interesting when you watch these Grand Prix riders, often you will see slight backward movements of their hands in the collected paces, particularly in collected trot, passage and piaffe. And I think that there may be some influence of the rider's hands aids at that level of competition or competition riding that may have an influence on the tendency for these horses to open their mouths. It's a contentious issue.
Absolutely.
Which I think leads us into the next topic, if we can go to the next slide, which is blue tongue. Now, in Denmark, a series of photographs were delivered to the Danish Equestrian Federation showing various Danish horses with an apparently blue tongue. And the Danish Federation would not assess still images of these assess still images. I think rightfully so. And the same thing happened at the Olympics. Can we go to the next slide, please? When a photographer, Crispin Johannesson, acquired images of a number of different horses, I think during warm-up, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. And these were then presented to the FEI. And my understanding is that the FEI spoke to the riders concerned, but advised them that this was not good PR for the sport, but it wasn't taken any further. There have been no sanctions. I have never seen a horse during warm-up or during competition with a blue tongue. I can't say it doesn't happen. As a result of what's gone on in Denmark, there was a Danish vet who went to the stable, her own stable, where her own horse is, and she took some photographs of a horse's mouth and tongue, and she changed the angles of the camera. And in some of the photographs, although the horse was standing at rest, in some of the photographs, the tongue looked blue. In other examples, the tongue looked pink, but the horse hadn't moved. It was just the angle of the camera that had moved. What concerns me about some of these pictures, which are said to be blue tongue, everything looks an odd colour. And some of the other photographs, the gums look blue as well. And that makes no sense to me, why both gums and tongues should be blue. And I don't think, and I've spoken to a lot of people in the last several weeks, we know a mechanism for why tongues go blue, if indeed they do go blue. And we don't know whether or not that this induces pain in the horse. We don't know for how long they stay blue. So again, I think it's a very contentious issue, but it's something about which we know very little. There was a study done in Australia because in racehorses, there is this practice in order to stop horses displacing their soft palate of keeping the tongue in a forward position in the mouth by tying soft fabric around the tongue and lower jaw in order to keep the tongue forward. And they simulated this type of action with a very, very tight stricture around the tongue in recently euthanized cadaver studies, specimens, and they could see compromise in the blood flow within those tongues. But at the moment, I don't think that we really know why, if horses' tongues genuinely go blue, and if they do go blue, why they go blue, and what the repercussions are from a welfare perspective. I mean, if there is compromise to the blood supply to the tongue, then obviously that's not a good thing. But I do think we need more evidence.
Well, and is it ethical? Like with that study where they tied the horses' tongues down, do you consider that to be like an ethical practice to study that?
I think it's very difficult. So I've had a long discussion with Dr. David Marlin, who's a physiologist and very interested in horse welfare things, and we discussed the fact, well, how can we learn more in that it would be unethical to try and replicate the situation that they're suggesting this is induced by. I mean, it's suggested that it is induced by the pressure of the bit. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so these are examples of the submission to the FEI. And you can see here that not only is the tongue blue, but there is discoloration of the bars of the horse's mouth as well. And then go to the next slide. So somewhat surprisingly to me, is that the chief FEI vet, Goran Akstrom, actually made a statement saying that he thought that the blue tongues were probably caused by high rate tension, and that it was the double bridles played a role in cutting off oxygen from the tongue, causing pain or unnecessary discomfort. And I find it extraordinary that the FEI chief vet made this statement, and then there's been nothing else from the FEI at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's implying that the double bridles were a causative influence. And yet the FEI are still holding strong that they are not going to change the rules until there is scientific evidence to the contrary. Pippa Cookson, who's an investigative journalist that writes for Horse Sport, which is a Canadian online publication, did a recent article about blue tongue, and she went to the FEI requesting further information, and she was told that they had nobody available to make any further statements at the moment, which is a rather sad situation, I think, because we've got conflicting evidence here. That you've got the chief vet saying that this is a welfare issue, and the FEI not doing anything about it.
Meanwhile, I think the public is focusing on individual riders and the judges who are following the FEI's rules. And it makes me really wonder if the same energy that was put into calling people out on social media for, as individuals for still pictures that show blue tongues, if that same energy was focused on encouraging the FEI to make double bridles optional, which doesn't restrict anyone's rights. It doesn't change really anything for anyone. I know you said people feel it's a slippery slope, but if there's going to be some change, it has to be in some direction, and anything could be considered a slippery slope. So it feels like if people understood this issue better, they could direct their energy to lobbying for changes that are, maybe not everything they want, but incremental in the right direction. And then, like you said, it would assist people like you with gathering data to find out more information about how much of a welfare issue this is.
Yeah, I would be delighted to follow this up, because it's intriguing to me, and I think that if there was a change in the rule, then we have to take the opportunity to see if it does make a difference in terms of the frequency of occurrence that mouth opening is observed. And I think that we need to persuade the whole dressage industry, and that includes the judges, that mouth opening should be penalized more than it is being. Now, some people will say, well, you have Glamourdale, he has this lovely fluid movement, so you just take one mark or half a mark off for the mouth being open. But surely, given that this is completely contrary to the judge's guidelines in terms of acceptance of the bit, surely this should be penalised more if we are going to institute change. Because if the judges only take off, say, it could have been a 10, but we're going to give it a 9, you're still saying this is acceptable. And so therefore the riders have no incentive to change.
Right.
If it was penalised by 3 marks off per movement, because we really don't want to see mouth opening, then the riders would have to change.
Yeah, it seems like it should be at least as severe as, changing late behind. I mean, I think it's important I think a lot of people don't understand how difficult it is to judge a dressage test, and how the human eye can only focus on so many things. And it is much easier to look at whether a change is clean then to look at whether it changes clean and also what's going on with the mouth and the ears and everything else. Again, it takes a very a trained eye, a very refined sense of the whole picture. But yeah, it really doesn't make sense that if a horse's mouth is gaping open, whether the tongue is blue or not, that is not penalized at all, much less as much as any other fundamental problem.
Yes, so you could, for argument's sake, have one judge whose sole job is to say, for each individual movement, is the head behind the vertical? Is there repeated tail swishing? Is the mouth open? And that's their only job, to focus on those three things.
I believe in, I think it's cowboy dressage. They have a harmony judge that does serve that function. And it's that idea makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think we need to think a little bit outside the box, and we have to change.
Yep.
And we have to make the riders aware of the necessity to change for the good of the horse and for the good of the sports.
Absolutely. Yeah, for the social license.
Yeah, I mean, I'm passionate about these sports. I would love them to continue.
Me too.
But I think we have to be prepared to say we have been doing some wrong things. These are what we acknowledge as problems, and this is what we're going to do to try and improve. Because and we have to do that in a cohesive way.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not to say that the people who, sort of are most outspoken and sort of want to burn it all down and start from scratch. It's not to say that those people aren't doing good work, because I do think that we need people to call people's attention. I think, raising the profile of these issues has really been done by the people that are the most passionate and most outspoken and probably the most extreme in terms of what action they want to be taken. And I think those people have really served an important purpose. But then once you burn things down, you have to rebuild. And, I think that's what we're talking about here is, you have to have a plan to rebuild before you take things down. And it's always better to deconstruct the old ways in a methodical and well thought out way in order to prevent the gap from being filled with something even worse.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I think today was addressing some controversial issues and indicating some possible ways forward, with the idea that we're going to try to sustain equine sports in as ethical way as possible.
Absolutely. Our goal is education, which gives people the tools that they need to speak out, to take action, to do things differently, to be good examples of how to do things differently, and also to reach out to these governing bodies and let them know what they feel needs to happen. And like I said, I think if the same energy was put into that has been put into sort of the call out culture of tearing down individual riders and just outrage online, I think we could actually affect some really positive change and make people feel empowered instead of helpless to do anything about this. And this is not just about dressage. I think we could identify issues in every sport where an informed and well-balanced approach would only benefit the horses.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
If you guys are ready, we did have something that we've brought up in past lives, but we had a question/comment.
Why don't you take the slide down?
What's that?
Why don't you take the slide down?
see here. Sometimes things go faster and slower than I want them to. We'll put this on for now. Um, so the question was, what do you think about riding schools? So in the context of this conversation, and it's difficult to learn the teachers this new way, teach the teachers. And this came early on in the discussion, I think, of looking at coercion and things like that. And I know we've talked about schooling horses before, so if you want to maybe comment on that real quickly before we wrap up.
My observation of riding school horses has taken place over many, many years, but more objectively recently. I think that there are a lot of horses that have chronic low-grade discomfort at riding schools, which is why they're slow horses and good for beginners. I would like to see more use of mechanical horses to teach riders about position and balance, rather than learning that necessarily on the live horse. And I would like to encourage riding school owners to better use analgesic drugs to improve these horses' discomfort, so that those learning to ride were not constantly exposed to grumpy horses, horses with their ears back, horses swishing their tails, which I think conditions people to think that these behaviors are normal for horses when they are not. And I think that we have to change the language that is used by riding teachers. And it shouldn't be kick, 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 hit it now because it's not responding to your leg. We have to move on from that. But in order to move on from that, some of these horses have got to be made a little bit more comfortable. And I think if people were more willing to use low doses of pain-killing drugs, that could make quite a lot of difference.
I'll add to that. I actually have a couple of students who run riding schools, and what I see them doing really well is that they teach their students a well-rounded, comprehensive sense of horse caretaking, not just riding, but we always we do workshops on enrichment and cooperative care and other ways that you can improve your management of horses. And so I think anybody who rides horses should have that understanding, and riding schools are the perfect place to start teaching that, because the way that you learn things in the beginning is generally how you do things throughout the rest of your life as you add to that. Not many people switch gears mid course, and so I think starting out, kids particularly, but adults as well, with a comprehensive education about welfare and how horses communicate, whether it's the 24 behaviors and other body language, or their genetic history, all of those kinds of things. Just having a basic understanding of who these animals are, what they need, and what they want, and how they communicate is all part of getting involved in the sport. So I think I do see some people doing that well, but there's a lot of riding schools that have a lot of opportunity to do better. And that's something that we at Train with Trust Project are passionate about helping with. So if you have a riding school and you want to improve the way you do things, please get in touch.
Yeah, I would echo that. And just the conversation looping back to how we started about situations where we want to ask ourselves, why is this behavior happening? Why am I choosing this technique? All of that is a bit of a culture shift, right? And riding schools are a great place to start that, because kids can learn these things as part of their framework. So really nice way to wrap things up.
Yeah. And I would add one other thing to that, which is that it's fun.
Yeah.
This picture that's on the screen, this little mule, hitting mule, was in training for getting her feet done and handled. And this was her doing enrichment, and us teaching people about how to use enrichment as a part of that process. Because we were creating a lot of stress for her in asking her to do things that she was uncomfortable with, and we needed her to have the opportunity to express her natural behavior and decompress. And so doing stuff that people think of as just for fun is actually an important part of overall welfare.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. I did post a couple of things in the comments. I posted the link to Jody referred back to our discussion of what does a happy horse look like. Another great way for some culture shift is really focusing in on what it does look like and what Dr. Dyson was able to point out what a comfortable horse should be moving like. So I added that in the comments here. So we'll post some other things in there as well. Um, Sometimes the slides want to advance, sometimes they don't. Here we go. So our next conversation is coming up in just a couple of weeks. And we've mentioned several times that we have the 24 behaviors checklist or the Ridden Horse Pain Ethogram with a mobile field guide that has illustrations that's available on our site. But Dr. Dyson has also compiled a list of what we call additional behaviors. So these are other things that you can look for that might demonstrate your horse is uncomfortable. So we wanted to go a little bit more in detail, getting back to the 24 behaviors checklist and the application of the additional behaviors checklist and how everybody can use those, being empowered to observe your horse, track your horse's behavior, and use these free resources that we make available to you. So coming up in 2 weeks on October 3rd, we will be discussing those. Again, you can download these free resources on 24horsebehaviors.org. Dr. Sue Dyson has co-authored a book with Sue Palmer, Harmonious Horsemanship, Use of the Ridden Horse Ethogram to Optimize Potential, Partnership, and Performance. And we highly recommend that as well to help facilitate tracking your own horse, spreading the word with others who are in positions of influence to help observe many people's horses. So sharing it with your trainer or your friends group. And with that, I'm going to go ahead, stop sharing screen, and I think we'll wrap up for this week. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.